Tonight on Contemporary Classics, I am so pleased to have an interview with composer Jeremy Gill. We are recording this on January 6th, 2018 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, following last night's world premiere of his new work, Eine Lindelei, by the Harrisburg Symphony Orchestra under the baton of Stuart Molina. This work was commissioned by the Lois Lerman Grass Foundation. Welcome, Jeremy Gill.
Thanks, Dave. Great to be here.
Let's start with your background. You were raised here in the Harrisburg area.
Yeah, I grew up here. I was born in Harrisburg, but grew up in Mechanicsburg, right across the river. And then middle school and high school in Lewisberry, Pennsylvania, which still has a population of, I think, under 400. Mm-hmm. So it's a very tiny town. But I finished high school there and studied oboe, and I started out on saxophone, and then I studied oboe, and then piano and composition, all here. So I played in everything: town bands, dance bands, church orchestras, all this. And then I went to Eastman for my undergrad, and I never returned to the Harrisburg area to live, but I did my graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And while I was there, I was invited to join the Harrisburg Symphony staff as the assistant conductor. And then later on, we got a Music Alive grant for me to be composer in residence with the orchestra. So even though I never moved back to Harrisburg, I always kept my ties here. And I've had a lot of great opportunities in the area.
I think last night at the after-concert performance, Maestro Molina indicated that you premiered 4 works here with the Harrisburg?
Yeah, so 3 of them were written for the symphony. So the first work was when I was the Music Alive composer in residence. That was back in 2003. That was the first commission from the symphony. And then they commissioned the clarinet concerto that's on the new CD, Before the Resting Tides. And that clarinet concerto is Notturno Concertante. That was in 2014. And then Eine Lindelei last night. And in between, they also premiered my first symphony, which they didn't commission, but it was my doctoral piece, my graduation piece from Penn. It was dedicated to George Rochberg, who was my mentor sort of privately. And it had been read by the Curtis Symphony. That's the way the Penn composition department works. But it had never been performed publicly. So the Harrisburg Symphony premiered that piece as well.
So you started with oboe and saxophone?
Yeah, saxophone and then oboe.
Why did you move from saxophone to oboe?
As I remember, my band teacher, who's a local clarinetist, Larry Greer, actually still teaching and playing in the area, he thought I had talent as a player, just generally, and wisely early on thought I should put my energies into more rare instrument. I think that happens a lot with the sort of middle and high school programs. You have a lot of talent as a violinist, and you have a smart teacher that says you'd be a pretty good violinist, but you'll be an amazing violist. Competition is lesser, or there's just more opportunities. They'll guide you into that direction. So I think that's what happened. Like, that was his idea, was that I could get a lot more opportunities a lot quicker if I was playing the oboe. And that did, in fact, happen. But I think he also sensed very early on that my inclination was toward classical music. So I remember actually sitting in my basement at home when I was growing up. I had a Barry sax that I borrowed from somewhere, and I would play along with Beethoven's symphonies, play the cello parts. You know, I'd put the record on and play along. So I'm playing the quintessential jazz instrument, and for whatever reason I had no interest in jazz, and I was playing Beethoven symphonies on my saxophone. So it made more sense from a repertoire perspective as well to sort of steer me towards the oboe.
Why did you move on to composition from performance?
So I don't actually remember making a choice about that. It just sort of was a natural expression of just, I was playing music by other people. And then at some point I started playing music that other people had never heard before because I was imagining it. Strangely enough, when I started composing, I guess this is not so odd, I wasn't composing for the saxophone or for the oboe. I was composing at the piano. So I remember the first piece that I completed was completely improvised at the piano, and I wasn't studying piano. We had one in our house, and my sister studied actually, but I sort of played around on my own and taught myself. But that was the instrument I went to when I was composing. I actually started studying piano much later, much too late to be a really fine pianist. It wasn't a barrier to me. It wasn't a different thing. It was just I just felt like that's what musicians did. They also sometimes made things up. And I did, of course, even though I wrote at the piano, the first pieces I wrote were for the ensembles that I was playing in. So,
and this was in college?
No, this was it. My first piece was premiered when I was 12, actually. And it was for a church orchestra that I was playing in. So a weird combination of, basically band with a couple of violins hanging out. But yeah, so I just scored it that way because those are the musicians that I had. And I remember the orchestra director bringing me manuscript paper and showing me how to make a score. And that was it. I just wrote for orchestra.
So that was what I like to call the quartet for the end of time style of writing. You write for what you've got.
Yeah, very much, yeah.
When did you publish your first manuscript?
So I self-publish. My orchestral music is available from the Fleischer Collection in Philadelphia, which is it's not a rental agency. It's a library, a lending library, and it's actually the largest lending library of orchestral music in the world. I think definitely in the country. A lot of composers don't know this, but they prepare parts for orchestras, and they prepare the parts at no cost to the composer. All they need is a premiere. And they charge a nominal renting fee to the orchestra, and they recoup the costs of production, and then they have a new work in their library. So for me, it's perfect because I prefer to do everything myself, and they do all the stuff I can't do, right size paper and all that kind of preparation. And they deal with shipping to the orchestras and making sure all the parts are back, and if they don't get them back, they make a new one, and all that stuff is taken care of. It's a great middle ground. You don't have to rely on publishers, which have a kind of a sketchy relationship now, where it's not clear that having a publisher is really an asset at this point. Mm-hmm. For very few that the publishers decide to really push, it's great. But I think for the majority of composers, it's just better to do it yourself. And even some extraordinarily successful composers like Jennifer Higdon self-publishes. It's all in-house. Yeah.
Tonight on Contemporary Classics, I am so pleased to have an interview with composer Jeremy Gill. You began composition very early and then continued periodically throughout your development. So when you went off to Eastman, was composition really what was in your mind?
Yeah. Actually, when I started composing, I never stopped. That became a constant in my musical life. So since undergrad, grad school, and post-grad school, for instance, I don't play the oboe at all anymore, but I perform a fair amount on piano and I conduct a lot. But that's all when I'm not composing, or these are my day jobs. When I went to Eastman, I already knew at that point that composition was going to be my primary focus, so that was my major. But I did audition in composition, piano, and oboe. And I may have even sang for somebody, actually. But I did study composition as a major, piano as a primary instrument, and oboe as a secondary instrument. A lot of conservatories they take to fill their orchestras. So we would have 4 oboists in each class. So I was the extra oboist, and one of the 4 left. So I was shifted into that rotation, and by the end of my time there, I was playing like an oboe major. I was playing so much in the orchestras and the wind ensemble, the chamber groups. I had a quintet, and it was great. I loved it, and my teacher was one of my favorite music teachers ever, which is Richard Kilmer. He's still there, and one of the great oboe professors. I learned so much from him about music. Even though I don't play the oboe, I retained so much of what he taught me just about being a musician. I'm really glad that it worked out that way.
And undoubtedly you use that a lot in composition.
Sure. my favorite place in the orchestra was sitting second oboe. So I had all of the fun and none of the pressure, except for these Dvorak symphonies like we did last night. So the second oboe in the Harrisburg Symphony was my high school oboe teacher, Tom Rowe, and he's playing that second movement with those low oboe parts, and you're hiding in the middle of clarinets and bassoons. They're so hard. That's the one sort of big pressure second oboe moment I know. But you get to experience the orchestra from the inside out. I think that's why so many composers love to play viola, Hindemith, Mozart, because you're in the center of the ensemble physically, but in the case of the viola, you're also sonically in the center. You can hear it from the inside out.
Now, even though you grew up in the computer age, you actually sit at the piano with pen and paper.
I do.
To write.
Yeah.
Why?
I mean, it's how I always did it. So I guess you do what you learn. But I don't know. I feel like on some level I have to be really committed to what I'm writing if it's going to take me so long to physically write it down. If I'm writing an ostinato texture, for instance, I have to write it out. I have to write out every note every time it repeats, say. And I won't do that unless I really want to do that. It just takes too long. So there's kind of a forced reevaluation that's happening all the time. When I'm writing for orchestra, I write pretty much directly to full score, so I'll do some sketches. I don't write a short score of the piece from beginning to end. When it's going well, a day's work could easily be 2 pages of orchestral music, which might be a few seconds. I'm paying attention to every detail. I'm writing every articulation in the second oboe, thinking about it. Do I want exactly what I'm writing? And often I'll get halfway down the page and realize that this articulation was wrong, or the balance is not going to work this way, and so I'll make a revision as I'm going. So I tend not to revise a lot after I compose, and I think that's part of the reason is I'm revising so much while I'm actually physically writing the score. But also for me there is a kind of a sensuous pleasure just to write, by hand. I don't know, I just feel a connection to the page in a way that I don't with a computer screen. I probably would learn if I used the computer. I would learn to feel that same way. But I'm that way with books. I don't read on a Kindle. I read on a real book. All that stuff. For me, it just somehow the connection feels better to me.
Tonight on Contemporary Classics, I am so pleased to have an interview with composer Jeremy Gill. Well, let's start talking about 2 of the works from the new album Jeremy Gill, Before the Resting Tides. And we're going to talk about the 2 sort of like bookends. The Serenata Concertante, which is the oboe concerto, and we'll talk about the Nocturno Concertante, which is a clarinet concerto. Thinking about it as a concerto, and of course the Serenata Concertante, the commission was for Aaron Hannigan through the Dallas Symphony Orchestra, and that was premiered on January 29th, 2016. As a concerto, I think of it as individual movements. It's one continuous piece,
right.
So it's not divided into movements. But I always try to divide things into movements. Is there a natural divisions that occur in this work?
Yes, for sure. So I thought of it as 3 movements too. And in fact, I wrote the movements in 3 different places. So they have even more division there than might normally be. So I actually started the piece in Philadelphia. And then I moved to Boston. And in between, I spent a month at the McDowell Colony in New Hampshire. So wrote the first movement in Philadelphia, second movement in McDowell, and then the cadenza and the third movement in Boston. So it's a 3 geographical location piece.
So the cadenza is actually part of the third movement.
It's really, I mean, it's almost its own movement. It's kind of a recapitulation of lots of ideas from earlier in the piece and then a transition into the last. And it's a huge cadenza.
Uh-huh.
Erin told me or said somewhere that she wanted two things from the piece. She wanted a big cadenza. She didn't want it to be called a concerto. And I have no memory of her saying, don't call it a concerto and write me a big cadenza. But maybe she did, and it just sort of went into my subconscious, and I did it. But yeah, the cadenza it's both. Sort of is a wind down from the second movement, then goes lots of different directions. It comes out the other end into the third movement.
Yeah, because I put it in the second movement when I was dividing it up, sort of as emotional completion.
Yeah.
At the end of the cadenza, it's sort of like an emotional completion.
Yeah.
You hear a little wood block, and then you go on to some quiet strings that then build up from there.
Right.
So that was
big thinking. After the strings and the big sweep, that really feels like a formal division. Yeah, the beginning of the third. Yeah, so I think I knew that from the beginning when I started writing the piece. I think I knew that it would be in three relatively clear sections.
So let's talk about the first section.
Okay.
It begins with sort of these downward cascading arpeggios in the strings, with a sort of sustained oboe on top, and then it seems to switch. To me, it switches to sustained strings with runs of the oboe.
Yeah.
And then has this explosion, fortissimo explosion of the woodwinds and the oboe. And to me, that was sort of like an end statement, because then you go on to an oboe solo with sort of French horn as the next step. And to me, that was an emotional release, that big explosion. But I don't know where that comes in your thinking.
I think if we're thinking about the same spot, there's no sonata form or anything in the first section, but I thought of it as the end of the first theme, and then there's a secondary theme after that. So it definitely also has a formal kind of break. I think of the opening as the very opening as a kind of introduction where you say the cascading strings and the oboe comes in over top. I think of that as sort of a big upbeat. And then when the strings are sustained and the oboe starts to play the runs, I think of that as the primary thematic material of the piece. And that, I was very consciously thinking about the opening solo of the Strauss Oboe Concerto, which I think is the best oboe concerto. So to have this sort of calmly virtuosic oboe writing, that's that first section. The explosion you mentioned is sort of the end of that.
And so then after that, which is the solo oboe with French horns, and then it goes into sort of like this agitated string portion with the oboe running over the top of this agitated string portion.
That's what I think of as the secondary.
That's
theme.
The secondary theme.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it does. Whatever. However people hear it is fine, but that's how I thought about it. Yeah.
And then this sort of agitated section then shifts from strings to woodwinds, and then it ends with this beautiful plaintive melody. And in my thinking, boy, that sounds like a second movement. That plaintive oboe theme almost sounds like the beautiful slow adagio sort of
where the harp is.
Yeah.
That is the second movement for me.
Okay, that is the second movement for you. Okay.
Yeah. I think I may have stolen the idea of that from my high school composition teacher, actually. Robert Lau, he wrote a big piece for chorus and orchestra. I think I was an undergrad in college or something. I came back and heard it. And he had a really beautiful movement, I remember, for oboe and harp. That sort of lodged that combination in my head and used it here.
After that, we have these sort of fast runs in the clarinets. And with little bursts of the oboe and trumpet sort of like back and forth, like, almost like a conversation.
Yeah, they're in canon,
Yeah. And then that sort of ends with this sort of chorale in the strings.
Yeah.
This sort of lush, harmonic structure in the strings, which then begins that long cadenza, that long oboe cadenza.
Right. Yeah, that chorale texture in the strings It's a very dense chord progression. It cycles through the piece in lots of different places, but always in very different guises. So you wouldn't necessarily hear that as a repeating idea, but it was one of the kind of core structural elements in the piece. Yeah, and there it is, very beautiful and slow and expansive. You can really hear it there. Other times it's faster and, more dense.
A lot of people think that fast and complex is virtuosic.
Uh-huh.
I tend to like the combination of the fast virtuosic with the beautiful sustained tone of the instrument.
Uh-huh.
And this piece has both.
Oh.
The cadenza part particularly has a lot of that intricate and complex movement of the instrument. But there's also these absolutely gorgeous themes that just permeate this work. What's your attitude about what is virtuosic? Because you said she wanted it, with a cadenza, and that often says virtuosic.
Yeah. Well, I think, like you were suggesting, virtuosity is not just who can move their fingers the fastest. And that kind of sort of athletic virtuosity is very impressive and exciting, but there, of course, is also expressive virtuosity. And, that's why these exam pieces out of the Paris Conservatoire, the Morceaux de Concours, that's why they all have that very expressive opening section, and then the typically virtuosic fast stuff at the end, because both are essential elements of being a performing artist. And if you play the oboe, which I did, one of the great joys of playing the oboe is playing a long, beautiful melody. You get to do it all the time in the orchestra. One of my teachers, Christopher Rouse, refused to give beautiful oboe solos in his music because he said they had too many of them in the repertoire. It was time for other winds to have a chance.
Everybody makes fun of the oboe, hence all the oboe jokes.
Right.
In the hands of an amateur, the oboe can be excruciating. In the hands of a professional, it's probably one of the most beautiful instruments one can imagine.
Yeah. I mean, it is along with the French horn one of the most difficult instruments to master. But it's just a gorgeous sound. And I think a lot of why student oboists sound so bad is the reeds are terrible. That's part of learning how to play the oboe, is learning how to make your own reeds, or at the very least how to tailor them to your own embouchure. And they're extremely sensitive, so my teacher can't make me a reed necessarily, right? Because his embouchure or her embouchure is different from mine. So it's a very long process to get to the point where you play well.
The Serenata Concertante ends with, it's a combination of short runs on the upper strings to the sustained oboe that shifts around the orchestra a little bit, and then there is this tumult of the woodwinds and the upper strings, which leads to a sustained oboe and ascending cascades in the woodwinds. And I sort of looked at that and I said, this is almost the same but the exact opposite of how we began. Because it was the sustained oboe with the movement of the instruments behind it. In this case, the woodwinds rather than the strings.
Right.
But I thought it was a wonderful symmetry with the beginning.
So that chord progression that you mentioned in the end of the second movement, that shows up in the strings at the end too. You can barely hear it because of all the other stuff going on.
And you do very subtle things. You have the strings. Some of the strings have a sustained note. Uh-huh. Some of the strings look like they're maybe doing 16th notes, but very pianissimo, so it almost sounds sustained.
Yeah.
It and has this very dense texture. By looking at the score and then listening, I got so much more out of it from that density, because it almost sounded like it was almost two simultaneous notes, but then when you listen very closely, you could hear that sort of
right.
that subtlety. How do you come up with that?
Well, I think part of that is, we were talking about before, it's sitting in the middle of the orchestra, experiencing orchestral music from that perspective. There are all kinds of things that the second oboist does that nobody ever knows about, right? Because you can't hear it. It's buried in a texture, but it can bring incredible pleasure to the second oboe player. So some of the subtle things that I'll write into denser textures, I'm not expecting anybody, myself included, to hear something buried in the depths of the orchestra. But I still am writing it with the same kind of care and attention that I would lavish on the most prominent part, because I'm writing it for a human being that's going to sit there and work on it and feel that they're contributing to the greater picture. The spot that you're talking about, the moving notes, are actually reminiscent of the oboe running tune from the first movement. So there's also that kind of sense that they're subconsciously sort of rounding out the piece, right? That's not what you're paying attention to, but it's there underneath, undulating. So you have that sense of return. And I think that psychologically that can impact the performance too, because they feel like they're rounding it out. They feel like they're closing the piece, and that sort of feeling can spread throughout the orchestra.
And spread to the audience.
Yeah, exactly. Variations of instruments, sometimes just playing the folia chord progression with no what we think of as typical variation techniques. It'll just be the variation is the fact that the trombones are playing it now and not the strings or whatever. And this variation I sort of took from him almost entirely, because I thought it was so bizarre and so wonderful. And he wrote it for 3 trombones, and bassoon was on the bottom. And he uses the drums. Not exactly the way I do, but very similar to the way that I do.
Because you use sort of like a timpani and snare.
Yeah, like in a little dialogue.
Yeah.
I don't remember. I think he just uses timpani, or maybe he just uses snare. I don't remember, but it's very peculiar. It sounds totally out of character for his time. And then when my solo clarinet comes in playing these arpeggio figures, he did that sort of thing too with the flute in the orchestra. So his whole orchestra is sitting there, and he's got the trombones playing with the bassoon and the solo flute and these drums that play almost never again in the piece. And I just felt like it was so similar to the way I was conceiving of the orchestra in my piece, right, by using these pockets of instruments throughout. And again, it felt like the right thing at that time to have this kind of funereal chord progression, that I took that music from him. And because I also use pitch collection associations with different instruments throughout the piece, so the brass is often playing whole tone based music, and the winds are playing chromatic, and the strings are playing white tones, actually, no chromatic notes. Here the brasses start, Salieri has them playing in D minor. So I start them in D minor like Salieri, and as they keep repeating the folia progression, they get notes start altering very slowly, so that you wind up with these whole tone, but it still sounds tonal because you've learned that it is tonal, but they have these whole tone variations of the harmony. Yeah, so it's a quotation of the Salieri, but it's very much permuted.
And just as you said, that work at that time was very out of context.
It sounds that way to me, yeah.
This is very out of context.
Within my piece.
Yeah,
right.
It just comes out of the middle of nowhere.
Right.
And you went, whoa.
Right.
It's sort of like the Vivaldi that was much earlier on.
Yeah.
You hear that sort of Baroque-ish sound. Okay. But it passes quite quickly.
Yeah.
Where this is a very monumental piece of the music and a major transition.
Yeah.
So it really draws one's attention.
Yeah. One of the reasons that I allowed myself to do that in this piece is because it's all taking place in a dream, and dreams are strange, and that stuff happens all the time.
Tonight on Contemporary Classics, I am so pleased to have an interview with composer Jeremy Gill. And then it progresses into runs on the Celeste.
Yep.
Again, another instrument that pops up out of nowhere. And suddenly you have the Celeste, which is absolutely gorgeous. I love the Celeste. And with some sustained strings and the slow melody in the clarinet, and hear these little bursts of 16 notes in the background. And then you go to this martial rhythm.
Yeah.
Really with the winds and percussion, and there's sort of like a fanfare of the clarinet on top of this martial.
Yeah.
So very militaristic. And it builds and builds and builds and builds to fortissimo and ends. I said to myself, am I listening to Gustav Holst? I sort of like Mars and the planets. Sort of ends like that with this grand ending.
Yeah, so I wanted to do two things. One is that moment where the martial rhythm starts just three repeated notes separated by rest. That sound actually came from a specific experience I had. My wife and I walked the Camino de Santiago a few years ago, which was one of the great experiences of our lives. But we, of course, wound up in Santiago and went to Mass in the morning. And while we were sitting there, I heard this bizarre sound that I thought maybe was the air conditioning system or something. I don't know what it was, but you would just hear very quietly these boop, 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 this sound boop, 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 coming from somewhere. And there was singing and stuff, so it was really hard to hear it. I didn't know what it was. And finally, when we got out, it turned out that in the square, right, the plaza right in front of the big cathedral there were protesters protesting something. And they had little drums and these red plastic trumpets with a little bladder on the end of it that they were pounding on their chests in this rhythm, and they would make the note. So that you would hear this little drum and these notes. But the idea that it was an undefinable sound at first and out of context and unexpected, and then sort of discovered later, I wanted to use that in a piece at some point. I felt like the opportunity was here where we everything kind of dies down after that big middle section. We actually remember a little bit of the Vivaldi from the beginning, so kind of coming out of that whole dream. And then all of a sudden, they're actually off stage. The trumpets and the drummer are back behind the scenes, and you hear them with that little rhythm. And then it gradually moves on stage and gets louder and louder, and the fanfares continue. This is also the spot in the piece where Chris, the clarinetist, is only playing in the upper register. And of course, the upper register of the clarinet is the clarino area, where you'd expect to hear little trumpet parts. So the clarini would play these trumpet parts in the classical period. So he sort of takes on the role of a trumpet player at the end, and this whole martial thing builds up. So that whole thing I wanted to use and create at the end of the piece. But then also I had this massive orchestra, and the only other time that they play all together is that big explosion that you mentioned at the beginning of the piece. So they play this huge thing at the beginning, go away, and then you hear little pockets of instruments throughout. And I needed, just from an orchestrational perspective, I needed to have a moment where they could all, play again at the end. So that became the idea, was that it would just build up to this big climax, and finally, the brass could play and everybody could pull out all the stops. And Chris, somehow, he's got iron lungs. You can still hear him. The brasses, they're blowing their heads off in the back, and he's out there just playing these big scales and holding these high notes, and somehow I didn't expect you to be able to hear any of it. He was just there for theatrics, but he brought it out. You can hear it.
Well, we have been with Jeremy Gill, and I want to thank you so very much for taking the time away from the time you have to spend with the orchestra in the premiere of your latest work. I Knew Linda Lay, here sponsored by the Lois Lerman Glass Foundation in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, with the Harrisburg Symphony Orchestra. Thank you so very much.
Well, thank you, Dave. It's wonderful what you're doing, and it was a joy to talk to you.
Thank you.